I trust I can divest myself of this. I do certainly want to applaud Peter's main source for the humor scattered through his talk, which I believe is an essay I have some familiarity with, Save the Little Rubber Bear. I didn't know if it was stuffed or rubber, but now I'm able to confirm for those of you who are uncertain that it is indeed rubber, about which I will say nothing further.
It's leather.
Leather, there you go. Okay, well, it still has other connotations, I guess. Quickly, the Bill Felkner story is really quite comparable in many ways to the infamous Emily Brooker case in Missouri, and it's entirely possible that social work, I don't know it well enough. The question I would raise is social work a discipline that is in the throes of an ideology that needs in some ways to be countered by appropriate university action? And maybe, I'm no authority, I don't know. In any case, everyone who hears these stories, it's hard to encounter an academic who doesn't have the same response to the Emily Brooker story, which is, why the hell didn't he give her an alternative assignment as opposed to simply imposing the notion that she had to write something to the legislature in favor of gay rights? I mean, why not? Wouldn't the classroom have been more interesting with opposing letters to the legislature rather than mandating one? Though I will say that it takes me back 45 plus years to the time when I was president of my high school debating society, when I took the position that the best way to win a debate is always to argue a position that you don't believe in, because then you can be really cold-hearted about what effect your arguments will have. So there may be something in asking students to kind of take positions opposed to their own convictions. So that's, I think those are examples. The Felkner and Bruckner cases are examples of bad assignments and conceivably bad disciplinary consensus, or at least a bad consensus within a particular institution. And academia has its methods for correcting that, and indeed it should apply them. A distinction that I think needs to be made, which I find useful, however, I think students have intellectual freedom, and the AEUP defined that at great length in its 1967 Statement on Students' Rights, including freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom to choose their own course of study, to hold their own beliefs, and to be protected from prejudiced evaluation. But I actually don't think students have academic freedom. That, as I say, they have intellectual freedom, not academic freedom, despite some efforts to muddy the waters by claiming that they do. Now, you obviously could differentiate between two kinds of academic freedom, one possessed by faculty and one possessed by students. But because faculty academic freedom is based on professional training, expertise, and specific responsibilities, I think it's worth using two different terms to distinguish the two things. Peter brought up the AEUP's 1915 statement, which talks about the scientific method as a kind of model for intellectual inquiry. And I think it's worth saying something about it. The AEUP's 1915 statement refers to the scientific method not as a kind of model for, using the laboratory model for intellectual work as a whole, but it's in a kind of broad, multidisciplinary context. And what we meant at the time was rationality, willingness to test hypotheses against evidence, openness to counterclaims by peers, and so forth. It's not a choice between scientific method and disciplinarity. That's, I think, an intellectual error. But different disciplines deal with different kinds of evidence and negotiate scholarly debate differently. The humanities fields I know best, literature, history, art criticism, all have textual and historical evidence at stake. But the textual evidence is open to a remarkably variable interpretation, and the historical record changes continually. That is one of the slow-to-learn lessons that most humanities disciplines gradually have absorbed. History has known it all the while, is that the past keeps changing. The body of evidence available to you keeps changing throughout time. In my field, poetry, the primary evidence is the incredibly compressed and ambiguous language of the poem itself. And there are limits to what the scientific method will do for a poem, or what it will do for a painting, or what it will do for, in effect, texts or cultural objects that are that ambiguous and that radically compressed. And by the way, I hate to sort of prolong the trumping of culture or bicultural, but there is a field, excuse me, called cultural studies that I have some credit for bringing to the United States, and it evolved largely in Britain. People like Raymond Williams, Richard Hoggart, Stuart Hall, and it's that broader, very, very multidisciplinary notion of culture that I employed in my talk. Anthropology is but one small part of that particular intellectual history. It's not anthropology that I'm invoking, it's the broad field of cultural studies. And the excuse me, just grab a little water. The 1915 statement is one of the best things the AEUP has ever done, but it's also marked by its historical moment. Every attempt to speak timelessly, every attempt within human culture to voice eternal verities is marked by its moment of conception. The 1915 statement reflects, for example, a notion of students and their vulnerability that largely speaks to what was still a rural population in the United States. There was no television, no radio, no internet, and all of the cautions that the 1915 statement applies to exposing students to new ideas reflect a particular moment in time. The students we confront today often arrive from the farm, having visited the city. They visited the city on TV, they visited the city on the internet, and they simply don't have some of the kind of naivete that the AEUP felt they had in 1915, and the 1915 statement comes close to a kind of in loco parentis role, which really doesn't apply, I think, to the current times. There's no such thing as a kind of definition of any ideal that is not subject to historical change, and the model of the relationship between faculty and student that the 1915 statement articulates has, I think, evolved over time. Even so, the 1915 statement is a bit conflicted in its attitude towards students. It points out that if faculty members are not absolutely frank in their presentation of their ideas and their convictions, students are very discerning, it says, and from their first day in a university, they'll be able to tell that a faculty member is withholding. At other places, the 1915 statement suggests that you need to give students time to be ready to develop opinions before you can present opinions to them. Well, if one encounters students not ready to have opinions in today's university, you must be teaching somewhere else than I am. So I think those are some of the ways in which the 1915 statement, although incredibly eloquent on the faculty role, and really the founding document for the AEP on the role of the faculty, is working through notions of student-faculty relations that are particular to 1915 and that are not entirely germane to the world 100 years later, nearly 100 years later. In our recent statement on freedom in the classroom, Committee A spent quite a long time, over a couple of hours actually, just this past fall, discussing whether in revising it, because we first issue a statement for commentary, and then we take criticisms and comments and revise, and whether we should leave the analogy between Bush and Ahab in the statement. And one of the reasons we left it in is because although we were trying to speak trans-historically to a degree to the concept of freedom in the classroom, we also felt the document should testify to its moment of historical inception, that in fact we should not try to purge from the document the particular signs that it was written within a moment of history and written in response to particular stresses and concerns. That's one of the reasons we left it in. Not only because we thought the concern was valid, because we recognized that 20 years from now or 30 years from now, perhaps less, the average undergraduate might pick up freedom in the classroom and say, who was George Bush? I stood in front of a movie theater not only about a decade ago and heard some undergraduates behind me saying, JFK, is that the one that was shot? So historical knowledge can disappear rather quickly, and we wanted the document not to hide the stresses that produced its first articulation. Okay.